Sorry. So how is districting done? As I said, it's done because the census has broken up the country into census blocks, and it's done this for decades. And they split them up as they get too big. But they're usually just a whole bunch of small areas. And then when they take the census, they fill out a table with all the information which goes with that block. And as you can see, a lot of these blocks, 35 people, 40 people, not that many. These blocks in Austin will have more of this. This is, of course, the top of the list for Texas, which is Anderson County. And then once you have those blocks, you put them together in districts. And you're using the data to make sure you make the required needs for a district of whatever district you're drawing. These are precincts. I helped draw up the precincts in Travis County in 2020. This was the map for Pflugerville. But you can see how each of these areas have lines, which are the individual census blocks. So you just combine them into it. And it's not always that easy. Every race seems to have special rules. Precincts can't be more than 5,000 people, can't be less than 100, but you try to keep it not more than 3,000 because of growth. The U.S. congressional districts have a very unique requirement, which is the maximum difference you can have in districts in a state is 1. All the districts have to have exactly the same number, except the ones which have the odd ones off. So it's not always that easy. And then once you've drawn your district, you just publish the list of what blocks and what district it go into. I'm going to speed through this next section. I included it in the 2020 version of this because I just kept it in. That what I'm talking about here is map errors. I'm going to start looking for these in the districts they published today. I wish I had more time today to look at it. I could have used examples. But here is TX10 and TX17. And actually, this is from the 2010 map. So this is an old example. And then when they drew the House districts for the same area, this is their line. So, you can see that the line changes. And what happens is they create 3 small areas which have their own unique ticket, which under Texas law makes them a precinct. And since they're non-contiguous, they're 3 precincts, and they actually don't have many voters. But this didn't need to happen if they just were careful and both had the House district follow this road, we would have been all right. I would go through this one. This is another badly drawn set of lines. This is something they do all over the place. This is actually the Colorado River right down the center here. They misdrew the line so that two maps which go down the same line don't quite meet. And we have this precinct in this middle of the river, which, has no land, but by law has to be a precinct. So this makes it hard for election departments to run. You get a lot of odd things. I will talk about that in a minute. But let's talk about gerrymandering first. Gerrymandering is named after a guy named Eldridge Gerry, who was a politician at the time of the Revolution. He drew as governor of Massachusetts a district around Boston, which people said looked like a gerrymander. And so they started calling it Jerry's Mander. And thus we get the name gerrymander. The sad thing is Eldridge Gerry should be remembered for other things. First of all, he signed the Declaration of Independence. He was in the Constitutional Convention and refused to sign the Constitution until it had a Bill of Rights. He's one of the holdouts which gave us the Bill of Rights. And eventually he became vice president. But it just shows you that we remember our mistakes more than we remember our successes. So that's where we get the term gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is used mostly in voting, from what we understand, but you see a lot of times where might will pull in people or to increase their area. Taxing districts will try to pull in rich areas. Actually, there's MUDs which will try to have their official tax area not their full MUD area, so that they can control the vote. It's actually also used in drawing country lines, and I have 3 examples here. Ireland and Northern Ireland is a type of gerrymander. So was India and Pakistan, and so was Israel and Palestine. And we see how successful the gerrymanders were and how well they kept the peace. I will talk about this a little later in the presentation, but gerrymanders almost always increase strife. And these are actually really good examples of it. So gerrymandering, let's go to a real example. I was hoping to pull some from the map today, but I didn't have time. So if the first way, we all know about selecting your voters, selecting your areas to represent, but it can also be used to get rid of people. So if you have a person you don't like, you can actually draw them out of their district. And I'm sure there's something on the map which would show that today, and I didn't have a chance to find it on the map. The other way it's used offensively is if you have 2 people in 2 districts, and you can just draw them into 1 district. And we saw that with Greg Kassar and Lloyd Doggett, who have been put into the same district. That way they get rid of one of them. And I would use a map of that today, but I didn't have time to pull maps. So sorry about it. This other one's a little arcane, so I'm just going to flip through it quickly. If you have to draw 2 different districts in an area, you can draw one set of districts which go east-west. And then in your areas, you can draw for the second district, those lines to go east-west, and in the opponent's area, north-south. And the reason you do that is it gives you a coherent set of campaigns to combine. You only have to plan, but ours only have to plan for 8 campaigns here. But in this map, the Ds have to plan for every district. Every one of these has a different ballot. Now it's a strain on resources. It makes things hard. And you do see this, and I don't have a way of finding it in the map today. So, but that's just an odd form of gerrymandering. But let's talk about how gerrymandering actually comes about. So we go back to our 32 voters, 17R and 15D. If you're nice, you draw 7 equal districts and 1 Republican district, or you can be partisan and draw 4 Republican districts and 4 Democratic districts, or you can gerrymander, which is drawing your lines in a special way so that you get 5 R districts and 2 D districts and 1 tied district. Now, it is generally assumed you have to have the majority to gerrymander, and that is not true. You only have to have control of drawing the lines, because in this sample, the D's drew the line, and they have 5 districts, and the R has 3 districts. It's the control, not the majority, which determines a gerrymander. And we'll see that in Texas, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the trick to gerrymandering is twofold. The first one is you concentrate as many of your opponents in a district so that you seat those districts to them. And then the remaining opponents you dilute with the massive amount of your people you have left. So it's basically concentration and dilution. That sounds a bit nerdy. They call it pack and crack. but it's basically concentrate your opponents and then dilute the remainder. So there's a risk to this, which is called washing out. I actually told someone in April that I expected the Republicans to soon do redistrict simply because they're beginning to show signs of washout. I expected by 2028 we would have redistricting because of washout. What's washout is the problem of what happens if it's a D swing election, or I mean an R swing election, and this is the D gerrymander, R swing direction. All of a sudden, every one of your precincts, every one of your districts becomes competitive if it's an R swing election. Conversely, if it's a D swing election, nothing changes. They still have 3 districts. So the only danger of washout is to the people who threw the gerrymander. And that's because they're a little thinner in their districts. And we were beginning to see that with the Republican districts. It happens generally at the end of a cycle. And that's why I was saying 2028. And that's because the demographics start catching up to the lines. So let's look at a gerrymander. This is the current Tarrant and Dallas County lines. And if you look very carefully, well, actually, before we get into that, let me tell you that Dallas and Tarrant County combined is 41% white. There are 9 congressional districts which go through these. You would expect it to be 4 white districts. You would expect 5 or 6 minority districts. There are only 3 minority districts, and in the new map, only 1. Okay, so if you look at the minority districts, they're packed. It looks like they're going along. They're saying, "Oh, there's a minority enclave. Let me grab it. Oh, there's I'll grab that one. That's a white enclave. I'll avoid it." And so you get these very odd-shaped, concentrated patterns in a packed district or a concentrated district. On the and these are packs. It's from 41%. Some of these are 13% white, and they are the ones which were targeted by this redistricting. As I said, 2 of these districts are now white districts under the new redistricting. And I'm going to throw up these numbers here because you can see those are concentrated. 25 and 6 are real examples of dilution. You can see they pull out a dense quantity of Democrats here, and then they dilute them with a vast area outside of Dallas. So this little area of Arlington is linked to these 2 areas. And there's very little likeness for Latina in Arlington to a farmer in Rusk or Cisco. But that's the dilution. You take a little area concentrated with your opponent, and you dilute it with a large area of your opponent, your voters. So Texas is a very successfully gerrymandered state. These are 2019 numbers, but they're roughly the same as today. There are 5.6 million identifiable Democrats in Texas versus 5.2 identifiable Republicans. Remember I said you don't have to have the majority, you just have to have the control. This is an example of it. Now it's a little disingenuous because there are 11 million other voters. But one of the reasons they get swayed towards the R is the lines. If you're kind of forced to vote in the Republican primaries, you just kind of follow along because that's where you're being forced to vote if you're going to have any voice in who runs your local areas. But let's look at the racial setup of Texas. It's 40% Hispanic. It's 40% white and 20% other. Now, before you say that looks like a concocted sample, it's actually not. Hispanics are 40.32%, and whites are 39.68, I think it is, some odd number, which leaves 20% left. 13% are black, 6 are Asian, and the rest are other. But yeah, so you would expect 15 to 16 Hispanic districts. What do we have? We have 13 Democrats and 25 Republicans right now. And the racial make, which you can see does not match the political setup. And for the racial setup currently, we have 26 whites, 7 Hispanics, and 4 blacks. So you can see it doesn't match anywhere near the racial setup. And then, as I mentioned before, it'll flood in 2028, they're telling me. Then this is the only slide I could add today. The proposed representation is 31 white, 4 Hispanic, and 2 black. In other words, we have just basically half the minorities in the Texas delegation. When actually this is the line which should have been drawn smaller. We'll go into what happens with racial gerrymandering, the Voting Rights Acts later, but the 2020 is clearly illegal under the Voting Rights Act. And this one is just an embarrassment. Okay, we'll talk about that later. So let's talk about some of the problems caused by gerrymandering. The first I kind of mentioned, in Travis County, we have 880,000 voters. Because of gerrymandering, we have 3,451 different ballots. That means your neighbor might vote the same way you do all the way up and down the ballot, but there's 3,400 different ballots out there. Over 3,000 of them have less than 1,000 voters on that ballot. 2,700 have less than 10. And 1,730 have 1 voter or less. This adds a high cost in the millions of dollars to county election offices, and it has a very high error rate. They were still finding errors in their voting lists on districts in 2018. So, you know, it's because of all that, and it all comes down from the state lines. So the state lines in 2020 came up with 36 areas, which isn't that much, but the way they crisscross, 13 of those areas have less than 1,000 voters. 10 areas have 10 voters or less, and 4 areas have 4 voters. And once you have to draw precinct boundaries and commissioner and JP districts and everything else on top of it, it really fractionates because these are just the starting scratch. So the cost of running elections is greatly increased because of gerrymandering. Another problem is the strife it causes, and that part of that strife is how it disenfranchises people, and people don't quite realize it. If you think about local elections in this state, 34% of the citizens are Democrats who are voting in Republican districts, or in this example, D's voting in our districts. And there are 15.3% of R's who vote in D districts. Those people have no choice in their local offices because they're gerrymandered toward the opposite party. That means just in the local election, 49.6% of the people are gerrymandered. Almost half of the people have lost their voices in the local elections. And if you pull in the global case, of course, because of the gerrymander, 49% of the Ds don't have a vote in the larger offices because of the gerrymander. And you add the 15.3% of the Republicans who are disenfranchised locally, you have almost 2/3 of the voters disenfranchised. And this is a theoretically perfect gerrymander, the best you could do. Once you get in real life, it's actually very different than this. And then this is just one race. When you layer this 64% on with another 64%, and they're not 64%, they're 70 or 52%, 72% on top of another district, on top of another gerrymander, where the lines don't agree, and we just talked about the lines not agreeing. It means in Texas, and I never calculated it out, I'm willing to bet nearly 99% of voters are disenfranchised in some way. That leads to frustration. It leads to distrust in government. It leads to feeling you have no word in what happens. And as I say, that's 99% of the people in this country. It's 64% in just any district. So, with that frustration comes on the political problems it causes. So let's look at a regular election where it's Democrats and Republicans. Statistics tell you that the people who win a race in a fair district, one which is not gerrymandered, one which is drawn along natural lines, that the electorate will choose the candidate from the center. And as a result, the people who come into office are near the center, both from the Democrats and the Republicans. They're actually near enough, they can actually negotiate and compromise. With gerrymandering, we now make it so that the person who wins the primary becomes the elected official, which means it's the center of the party which chooses the candidate, and it's not even the center of the party. It's the people who vote in the primary, which is always towards the extreme of the primary. And as a result, the elected officials are now way apart from each other, can't compromise, can't talk to each other, and it leads to a lot of civil dislocation, which if you put on top of the frustration, it causes the higher amount of problems. And then you have what this causes in the way of policy. And it just so happens, once one side or the other has control, they actually choose policy from the far edge of the spectrum. And the 25% on the end, and ignore the other 75%. Okay. And we see this very much in the Republicans, that when Democrats take control, you see that too in a highly gerrymandered system. But a lot of times this 25% is the control of policy. In Texas, and this example is from 2020, and I just kept it in because it's a good one. Texans on gun laws. In 2020, 51% of Texans wanted stricter gun laws. 17% of Texans wanted less strict gun laws. What did the legislature do? Open carry. On full background checks, it's even worse. 81% of Texans wanted full background checks. 13% did not. Full background checks could not even get out of committee. It is something wrong with democracy when the 17% can get what they want and the 81% can't. And that's because with gerrymandering, we are rolling in this box. And then when the Democrats will roll in this box, and a good example of that is when Republicans are in control, we get massive tax cuts for the wealthy. When the Democrats are in control, we talk about taxing the rich and wealth taxes. Now, think about how this affects the environment. We have disenfranchised voters who are frustrated with the system. We have politicians who can't agree with each other and just shout and insult each other. We have policies disregarding 75% of the people, and you can find issue after issue, which are like this gun laws, whether it's abortion rights or selling off public lands. You can do the same mantra. There's something wrong when 85% of the people don't want to sell off public lands and 12% do, but somehow we're going to try to sell off public lands. It's the same thing over and over again on these policies. You use the same mantra. There's something wrong with democracy. So when you combine all that, plus, as I point out with the tax cut, you can't plan for the future because if the party in control changes, policy changes, which means tax laws changes, import-export laws changes, school finance, what's taught in school changes. There's no way for a citizen or a business to long-term plan. This sort of thing, if you think about it in the abstract, naturally leads to civil dislocation. And what do we see in our country right now? It's gerrymandering, more than almost anything else. That this is the sort of points I think we can make to the Republicans because it affects them too. They're thinking short term. I have control now. They don't think long term. So let's go on to the current case of the Justice Department redistricting. In late May, and Trump and the Republican strategists realized that there may be a wave election in 2026. They realized that the House will wash to the Democrats. And so they're trying to come up with even tighter gerrymanders to pull in more districts so they don't wash out, as opposed to, letting the majority decide. It got to the point in early June that the congressional Republican delegation got in on the thing and they start working on the maps, mostly because incumbents want to stay in their area if possible. And actually, if their base is in a certain area, they want to keep that in their district because that's where their money comes from. So the congressional delegation gets involved in June. That leads the Justice Department to issue a letter to the state of Texas saying that we have an illegal, constitutionally illegal racial gerrymander. We'll talk about that in a second, that it's wrong, but it's the false legalism which this is done on. July 9th, Abbott calls the special session, which we are in today. And of course, today they released the maps, which I didn't have a chance to put on the slide because I was in a meeting all day today. So the Justice Department letter comes from Hammett Gillen, who is the head of this Justice Department Civil Rights Division. It pointed to only 4 districts as illegal gerrymanders. Of course, they managed to use that as an excuse to grab a 5th district and disrupt all the other districts in Texas. It is based on a 5th Circuit ruling called Pettyway versus Galveston County. And it badly miscites and misunderstands the ruling. They're claiming the ruling makes racial gerrymandering illegal. The Voting Rights Act very clearly says that taking race into account is important so that the minority has a voice in the election. And we'll talk about the Voting Rights Act. And it's been very clearly understood that, yes, racial districts can be held there. They talk about what's called coalition districts. That's when you have multiple majorities which have to make up the majority. In one of the districts, in this case, TX 718, it's actually 51% Hispanic. So it's not a coalition district. So they're badly misciting this. And the real thing is Headaway v. Galveston, and this is a subtlety, was a group which was of minorities suing Galveston County, saying that they deserve a district. And the court actually ruled that a coalition of minorities cannot force a district after lines have been drawn. Okay, nothing about taking in coalition facts when you're drawing them. It's after the fact, and it's coalition districts. Is a very special subcase. And every other circuit in this country has ruled it on coalition districts like this and has said they have that right. It's the Fifth Circuit, which is the odd man out. And that's often the case with the Fifth Circuit. Also the ruling is not final. It's back down in the district court level being reheard. So there are things which can still happen there. This is a quote from the thing. The congressional district at issue are nothing more than vestiges of unconstitutional racially based gerrymandering. But they don't actually explain why it's unconstitutional. They just say it's unconstitutional. And then of course Abbott believed them. But it's all, this is the sand they're basing their legalities on. And it's really almost Alice in Wonderland when you start looking at the details. It does not hold legal water. So talk about the relevant case laws. The first one is, I have actually a list of these on this Substack, and I will put that into the chat if I can find both a browser where I can grab it from and the chat. Actually, I'll put it in the chat later after the discussion. But that has all the case laws involved. I'm not going to go into them in detail. But the main friend of us is the Voting Rights Act, Section 2. And the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, says it is illegal.
I'm getting the fuzzy guy. Fuzzy guy.
Okay. It is illegal to draw districts which effectively remove the minority voice, and not intentionally, effectively. It's a totally different condition. The claims that they didn't look at racial data doesn't matter if it's effectively removing the minority voice. And we'll talk about what it means to have a minority voice. The Voting Rights Act, Section 2, was upheld by the Supreme Court as recently as 2023 in Allen v. Milligan. And it's the exact same court we have today, the exact same justices. So even this current Supreme Court agrees the Section 2 of the Voting Act holds and is enforceable. So let's go into some of the case law behind it. Well, actually, let's go to some myths on the Section 2. The first myth is that the Supreme Court invalidated the Voting Rights Act. There was a case a few years ago where there was a big hubbub about them invalidating the Voting Rights Act. Then it became Section 5 was invalidated. No, actually what was invalidated was a small area of Section 4, which defined what districts got pre-clearance. Section 5 is the rules for pre-clearance. The Section 4, which got thrown out, the Supreme Court said the problem with that section in Section 4 is it was based on 40-year-old data and antiquated, and because of that, it couldn't be enforced anymore. So that small area in Section 4 was pulled out. It can be put back in if Congress comes up with a different metric. Second myth you keep here is the case Louisiana versus Calais. The Supreme Court will override Section 2. As I pointed out just 2 years ago, this court affirmed Section 2. This is just hopeful thinking on the Republicans' part. I hope. I mean, you can't trust the Supreme Court, but another myth. This case, Alexander v. South Carolina, NAACP, means that the court must take the legislature word that a gerrymander is political, not racial. That's why the Republicans are saying we're looking at politics, not races. The court actually found the plaintiffs the plaintiffs didn't actually show that it could be a political gerrymander without violating section 2. If they could show that, they would have won their day in court. They could have been put up another hoop to prove a section 2 case. The next myth is, and I've already talked about it, I can say I didn't look at racial data and I'm all right. As I pointed out, section 2 is effect, not intention. The next myth is the Fifth Circuit Court ruled XXX. This is always a problem with the way the press and we know about the courts. About 85% of the rulings you hear in the news are intermediate rulings of an intermediate court, but they're not the final ruling. They may even be rulings on the stay before the case is actually heard. But the way the press reports each of these is as if it's a final decision. And then 3 weeks later or next day we hear this next court overrode it, and you think, oh, well, the law is fluid. It is not. It's just that this is the system coming through with this rule being appealed, coming back until it finally gets to its final resolution. And the press does a bad job of reporting and educating us on this process. How many times have you heard when they report something like this? This is not a final, anywhere near a final ruling. So now we talk about some of the, oh, do I have another one? Okay. The next talk about the biggest case in section 2 cases is Thornburg v. Ginsburg in 1986. It actually came out and gave a description of what a racial voice is. And it says that a minority group is sufficiently large enough to form a single member district, and that the group is cohesive, and that block would have the ability to elect the candidate of its choice. Not necessarily always get the candidate against, but they will prevail. And that gives the minority the voice. This is actually an extension of the equal rights provision of the 14th Amendment, the equal I'm slipping on that, but it's backing up the 14th Amendment, and that's where it derives for. It's also derived from Article 1, Section 4, which gives Congress the right to come up with election law which overrides state law. In 1983, in Shaw v. Reno, they actually came out and actually said race can be considered when drawing a district because of the Voting Rights Act. But it can't be the only consideration. And it actually even spelled out that the bizarre shape and non-compactness of districts can be used as proof of a racial intent. Okay, so the things we always hear people complaining about district, actually the Supreme Court has already ruled that you can do that, or those districts look like a racial gerrymander. I bring up Cooper v. Harris, which said partisanship cannot be used to justify a racial gerrymander. Good luck, Texas. And I mentioned Allen v. Milligan again, which is the Supreme Court reaffirming all these other cases. I talked about Alexander, South Carolina. These are cases we don't quite go in their favor. And then, of course, Petaway v. Galveston County, which is what they're using as the legal basis of this. And I've already talked about why that's not valid. So the first question is, what can you do? The first is you can testify. Got Steve's slide. The first is you can testify. You can say, this is why I'm against this. You don't have to actually testify when you sign up. They ask your position on the issue. You say for or against, and then you say, I don't want to talk, but it's still taken into consideration. You don't have, well, on a lot of meetings, you don't have to testify in person. They will have online testimony. It looks like the committee meeting on August 1st is not going to allow video testimony. It's all going to be in person. I couldn't find a sign up for a testimony, but even if you can't testify, you should sign up, say no, and you can also write a written testimony and send it in, and that gets handed to every committee member. So you can, and I will give you the URL in the chat at the end when I give you the URL for the Substack. Right now, there is a committee hearing on the 1st, which is Friday. It starts at 10 o'clock in the morning. The first 90 minutes are administrative, and then I'll allow 10 hours of testimony. They'll probably break for several times in that 10 hours. They probably won't get through more than 70 or 80 people testifying, meaning that you probably have several hundred who are signed up to testify who can't get heard. That's, the current system. I will give you the link for that. As I say, you don't have to speak. You can just sign up and say you're for or against. You often can do it through your computer. This one looks like they're not allowing it. You can send in a written testimony of 3,000 letters, which is actually more than you can say in the 2 minutes they allot you. Actually, on my Substack, I posted the letter I sent to them on this. You can attend the hearings. I obviously did not get a chance to change the slide for tonight. As I said, the next hearing is August 1st at 10 a.m. The testimony won't start till 11:30. The actual room they hold this in is very small, and they have overflow rooms. So, but just being a big audience helps, show them that there's a population against this. I will kind of brag about myself. You notice in the July 24th hearing, I'm actually sitting in the front row waiting to testify. Needless to say, they cut off testimony before they got to me. You can call every representative, particularly the ones against the gerrymander. And that is because they need as much emotional support as anything. There are actually funds being created to help pay for their breaking a quorum if it happens. Breaking a quorum now has a large fine per day, which they have to be able to pay. So that people are collecting money for that, people collecting money to help hide them, help get them out of the state, whatever. Breaking quorum is a long tradition. It goes back to Lloyd Doggett and the Killer Bees walking out and what was it, 1982, 83? The Killer Bees? Do you remember? Mark?
2003.
2003 was the Killer Bees?
Yes.
Okay. Oh God. I'm so old I can't even.
And Elliot was part of it too. Elliot Nashtak.
Elliot, yeah. I remember Elliot. So that's so call them support them. Their funds being set up to help pay their support. If you hear of any Republicans which might be a wavering vote, call them. And then the last thing is you educate yourself. Educate others. You can use social media, word of mouth. I also add carrier pigeon. But any way you can get the word out. As I said, I was just trying to give you the facts to use when you're discussing gerrymandering. I wasn't trying to give a partisan argument. That once you go through all the facts, you really see gerrymandering is a bad thing, even from the gerrymander's standpoint. And I hope I've given you all enough weapons to fight and talk about this well. So at this point, that's the end of the slideshow. I will stop the share and I'll ask if anyone has any questions.
Is it worth contacting the senators?
Yes, actually it is. They're separate. They're representatives too. They're just a separate body. The House is going to be able to break quorum, and that's because they have enough members that if they leave, they can break quorum and have one member left, so that when the House meets, he says, "I don't believe we have a quorum," and the House has to shut down. The Senate, there are enough Democrats to break quorum that there's not one left to do the quorum call.
I had heard there were enough to break quorum, but
There's enough to break quorum, but not enough
to notice.
to notice.
Steve and Janice Rankin asked a question. It was a good one. How strong of an argument do you think is the fact that they're doing this mid-district? I mean, mid-decade, excuse me. She's an attorney, so you're gonna get good questions.
Well, the first part of it is they are using 4-year-old data, so they're using the population data from 2020, which means the demographics has changed. The Hispanic vote has grown. In 2020, there were less Hispanics than there were whites. Now we have more Hispanics than we have whites. So the demographics are changing, and they're not reflected in the numbers they are using. They are somewhat aware of that, but they are using old numbers. How strong is the argument? It's actually not very strong at all. Texas redistricted mid decade, was it 2013?
Yeah.
Yeah. That went all the way to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court at that time ruled there was no limit to a state redeciding to redraw its district. So unfortunately, it's on legal ground because the Supreme Court has ruled that way. Back when the Supreme Court actually was rational, so, or at least semi-rational. So there isn't really not much of a legal point. There is a case to be made and argued that they're not using accurate data for this, and it makes it hard and they shouldn't do it. But there's no legal side to that argument. Any other questions? I'm going to stop recording, but I have some questions for you.